This is Meghann Cuniff. I'm sharing some news about the Jay-Z versus Tony Busby ongoing litigation. We have some new declarations filed today in the Los Angeles case, and this is Jay-Z's lawsuit against Tony Busby, who is the lawyer who represents the woman who sued him for rape, sued him and Shawn Diddy Combs, said that they sexually assaulted her at a VMA party, after party, years ago, back in 2000. The lawsuit has been dismissed with prejudice, which means it's not going to be refiled. But there's still this ongoing fight between Jay-Z and Tony Busby about whether any of this is true, whether Tony Busby should be held liable for extortion and defamation, and then whether Jane Doe should be held liable for defamation. And then there's also a malicious prosecution. I went over the audio that Good Morning America played. They had a 1-minute snippet of the recording of the woman talking to investigators who worked for Jay-Z. And then later that day, actually, as I was doing the live, Tony Busby's lawyers in the LA case filed a declaration from Jane Doe saying that she was intimidated during her interview with the investigators, and going through a bunch of stuff that she said that's not true, et cetera, et cetera. So today, which is the filings that we have, Jay-Z's lawyers in the LA case responded with their own declarations, and then also filed a actual transcript of their entire discussion with the woman. So I think that's what we're going to get into right now. And this is the actual transcript from the recording, because we still haven't heard the entire recording, but this is the same recording that we heard on Good Morning America. They had a 1-minute snippet of it, and they played some of it. But today, Jay-Z's lawyers filed the actual transcript of the entire conversation. So this is it, and it's got kind of a very southern beginning. Remember, they're in Alabama here. Birds chirping, footsteps, knocking on door, dog barking. Hi, how can I help y'all? Investigator Henderson says, hey, how are you? Jane Doe says, good, how are you? Investigator Henderson says, uh-oh, puppy, can you step out for a second, or can you? I don't want him to bite us. Oh, he doesn't bite. Oh, okay. How can I help y'all? That's Jane Doe. And Investigator Butler says, how's everything? And names her. And Jane Doe just says, yeah. Investigator Butler says, how you doing? My name is Robert. This is Charlotte. We just came to kind of talk to you real quick, kind of run a couple things by you. We just kind of wanted to see what was going on. I know there's kind of a court case going on, and it is since gone away. Jane Doe says, yeah. Investigator Butler says, so we're just here trying to figure out what happened with that. We're actually thinking that you might have been taken advantage of a little bit by maybe an attorney. Does that sound like something that maybe that? Jane Doe says, who are you guys? Investigator Henderson says, we're not here to hurt you or anything. We just want to talk. Jane Doe says, how did you find out where I am? How did you find out who I am? Next page here. Butler says, well, based on the interview and all the paperwork that we've got, it was kind of pieced together. But listen. Henderson says, you're going to remain a Jane Doe. Butler says, very simply, they don't want your name to come out at all. They're kind of okay with that, with you being a Jane Doe. But obviously, now that everything's been dropped, they want to clear everything and make sure that, so basically, I had a few questions. And Jane Doe says, okay. Butler says, hoping that, again, if you cooperate and kind of tell us what's going on, everything remains a Jane Doe. We don't tell anybody who you are or what's going on. Nothing. Jane Doe says, okay. Butler says, so a couple of quick questions was, how did you end up approaching the attorney? Or did the attorney approach you? Or how did that work? And she said, something I saw on Facebook. And Butler says, you saw what on Facebook? She says, an ad. Do you mind if we, just so that the barking, all right, I'm sorry. They're talking about the barking dog that she has here. And he comes up a few other times here. But again, this is the February 21st interview between Jane Doe's lawyers. Or excuse me, Jay-Z's investigators and Jane Doe. Jane Doe says, I'm just curious as to how y'all found out or figured out who I am and where I am. because they said they wouldn't release it even. Investigator Butler says, so they kind of didn't, but just in the interview and some of the things, like when you take 4 little pieces of things and add them together, we narrowed it down to maybe 20, 30 people. And then eventually just doing background checks in Facebook, everything kind of matches. Charlotte Henderson says, and like I said, we still want you to be anonymous. I'm sure what they did, it had to have had something to do with who lived in Rochester and then moved to Alabama and is the age of that woman. They were probably able to identify the 20 or 30 names by doing people searches for that. And then, like he said, once they start searching those people, they can kind of piece together who the accuser would be of those people. But anyway, Henderson says, and like I said, we still want you to be anonymous. She says, okay. Henderson says, everything was Jane Doe, and that's exactly the way it's going to remain. But we just have a few questions. She says, okay. So you found what? You found a lawyer, or you found something on Facebook? Like, Jane Doe says, I found something on Facebook for the ABA, and they put me in touch with Tony, and then that's how it went. Butler says, Tony? Jane Doe says, Busby. Butler says, okay, so that's who contacted you first. Did you ever meet him? Jane Doe says, yeah. Butler says, okay, we're just double checking because I know he has a lot of people who work in his office. Jane Doe says, yeah, no, I met him. He flew me out to, Butler says, Houston. Jane Doe says, Houston. Butler says, okay, so you went and saw him there. And Henderson asked, did you go by yourself? She says, yeah. Henderson says, okay. This is 5 minutes into the conversation. He said, did he give you money to pay for the trip, or did he just reimburse you? He says, no, he paid for it. He flew her out there. Butler says, right, so he did pay. Okay. Since the situation, have you been paid at all for what's going on? Now, when you first talked to him, was he promising you anything, or did he help you with your story, or you got your story on your own? Like, what was the initial meeting with him like? Jane Doe says, the first time I met him was in a coffee shop. Henderson says, out there in Texas? Jane Doe says, in Houston. Butler says, okay, so you met him, and did you go through each steps, or he just sat down and you just talked? We talked about all that was going on to go through what had happened, she answered. Next page here. Let's see where we're at here. This is the February 21st interview between Jay-Z's investigators and the accuser. And Investigator Henderson says, so something happened, or did he tell you what happened? Jane Doe says, no, he didn't tell me what happened. Something actually happened when I was 13. I ran away and ended up there. Henderson says, but did it involve anybody that you named? She says, it involved Jay-Z and Diddy, but not the other two. Butler says, okay, why did it now get dropped? Jane Doe says, because I was too scared to go forward with it. They told me he was threatening to kill me. Jay-Z was threatening. Henderson says, who told you that? They told me Jay-Z was threatening to kill me. Butler says, who? Henderson says, who told you that? The lawyers, Jane Doe says. Butler says, the lawyers did? Henderson says, Busby? And Jane Doe says, yeah, he said that there were threats against my life and that saying anything else could get me in a lot of trouble, that he could come after me. Butler says, well, I can almost promise you that that's not accurate. That's probably what, so the problem is them going forward. I think they're facing a lot of repercussions from it. Go to the next page here. And I think they might have tried to talk you out of just getting rid of the case. Jane Doe says, okay. Butler says, so now I know you had the military service. How come, what happened to the military service that you just kind of left early? Jane Doe says, I just got injured. Butler says, you got injured? We saw some of your Facebook stuff that said some of the issues you have now is from the military. All right. So as far as you're concerned, the whole story you gave is accurate. Jane Doe says, yes. Butler says, they just talked you into dropping the case because now, well, I'm just going to say they talked you into it. But they kind of told you that, no, they talked me into dropping the case, Jane Doe says. And Butler says, okay, and you were not planning on dropping the case, but did they ever promise you money, or they just said, we'll see what happens? Or Jane Doe says, well, they said that I would get a payout, but I already knew that was not 100% accurate. Henderson says, did you sign an agreement or anything? Any kind of retainer? Like when you retain them to handle the case, that they would get 50% and you would get 50%? And she says, yeah, it was. I did sign something like that. Next page here. Investigator Henderson says, okay, that they would get it. Okay. And then when they dropped it, or when you dropped it, did they have to pay them expenses or anything? Okay. Butler says, no. Okay. She must be shaking her head or something. Charlotte Henderson says, okay, so you haven't paid them anything and they haven't paid you anything. Okay, so you honestly believe, and I don't know the entire story of what happened when you were 13, why you ran away and yada, yada. But Jay-Z, they honestly, you feel like they raped you? Butler says, we don't know. Okay, and this is crucial. It says, Jane Doe says, it was more Diddy, but Busby brought Jay-Z into it. So that's a crucial, like, verbatim quote from her right there. And Butler says, see, now, if you don't mind, can you explain that? Because that's kind of the... And Jane Doe says, he asked if Jay-Z was there, and I said yes. Butler says, so when you originally sat down at the coffee shop, you told him that Diddy did something to you? Jane Doe says, yes, because it started out, it was just Diddy and another blank, another redacted name, and then Jay-Z came in. And Butler says, but not from your mouth? And Jane Doe says, yeah. Butler says, he asked you about Jay-Z? And Jane Doe says, yeah. Butler says, but Jay-Z you're saying he was definitely there, but he had no part in it, or he was just, and Jane Doe says, he was there. Henderson said, he was just there, but he didn't have anything to do with any sexual acts towards you. It was strictly, and Jane Doe says, yeah. Henderson says, okay. Butler says, okay. And now we're talking about, it was at a party or something like that, right? An after party. So he was just present at the party. Okay. So you only got into Jay-Z's name because he was asking you. And did he suggest that Jay-Z might have had some part in it? And Jane Doe says, he was the one that kind of pushed me towards going forward with him, with Jay-Z. And Henderson says, with Jay-Z, Busby did? Yeah. Butler says, do you know why? Jane Doe says, no. Butler says, he never mentioned it. Did you ask, like, why do you keep harping on? Jane Doe says, no. This is 10 minutes into the conversation. Butler says, okay. And Henderson says, why'd you do the interview with NBC? Who set that up? And Jane Doe says, Tony did. Henderson says, Tony? Butler, Busby? And Jane Doe says, Busby. Henderson says, Busby. Okay, so where did you do the interview? Jane Doe says, in Tony Busby's office in Houston. Henderson says, okay, and he flew you out there again for that? Or was it the same time? She says, no, it was at the same time he flew me out. He called NBC and he got him there. And Henderson, Jane Doe says, yeah. Henderson says, okay. And Butler says, okay, that's all right. Listen, we definitely appreciate that you're being honest. Because like you said, again, when it comes to like Jay-Z, we're kind of here on kind of his behalf-ish, because we believe that he said, I don't even know what, I had no part of that. And if you were pushed into saying that, that's something that's kind of worthwhile to us. And Jane Doe says, you're here on Jay-Z's behalf? Butler says, not on his behalf. They said behalf-ish. Henderson says, indirectly. But Jay-Z had nothing to do with this, correct? And she says, Jane Doe says, right. Henderson said, other than he was at the party that you were at, so I mean, he did not assault you? And Jane Doe says, no. Charlotte Henderson says, would you be willing to give us an affidavit to that effect? Butler says, and from what we were told, and if you do an affidavit saying that that is true, they pretty much have said that they will remain keeping your name is Jane Doe all the way through. I mean, they're basically telling her that if she doesn't sign this affidavit and cooperate with them, they could publicly identify her. I mean, that's what they're doing here. But let's keep going here. Next page, actually. But yeah, look at the top pages where they keep emphasizing that to her. Butler says they're a little more upset with, they think you're more of a victim on that end of the case, that they took advantage of you and kind of made you say things that maybe were not accurate to make the case better. Henderson says, right, to get them more money. And Jane Doe says, yeah. Butler says, so if that's true, that's something we kind of, and Henderson says that we need to know. Butler says, because again, I hate to say it, you have children. They have children also. If one was responsible, that's one thing. One was not responsible. His kids, his wife, his family, now they're hearing that he might be responsible for something that nobody wants to be accused of if they didn't do it. Do you understand that? And Jane Doe says, yeah. Just 1 second here. So yeah, this is the transcript from the February 21st interview that investigators did with Jay-Z's accuser. This was just filed today in Los Angeles. Go to the next page here. Investigator Butler says, nobody wants their kids thinking bad of them. And Henderson says, right. So would you be willing to help us as far as the fact that the things that you said about Jay-Z were not correct? Butler says, we just want to set the record straight so that he's able, so that, and Henderson says, so that he can move on and this can get out of his, being accused of this, because it didn't happen. Correct? Oh, and Jane Doe says, you have a good day, guys. And Butler says, are you sure? Henderson says her name and says, come here. It's okay. Butler says, I promise we're not here to hurt you. We're not. And Henderson says, we're going to try to help you. We're not doing this to hurt you. This is all to help you. Believe me. What's wrong? Tell me, talk to me. Butler says, yeah, if you have any concerns, tell us what they are and we'll see if we can. Henderson says, just talk to me. If Jay-Z didn't have anything to do with it, it's okay. But if he did, we need to know. I promise you, we're not here to hurt you. And like I said, we're going to keep you out of it. You're going to be Jane Doe. Butler says, we're just going to set the record straight. That's really the only thing we're here for. And Henderson says, I promise. Jane Doe says, I don't want him getting mad at me. And Henderson says, he's not. And I don't know where these threats, that came from Busby. And that never happened. Jay-Z never said anything like that. She says, but you're saying he found me and you guys are here because he found me. Henderson says, I don't know that he found you. Butler says, I don't know if he found you. Like I said, we're going to keep your name as Jane Doe. We're just independent hires. Like we just come talk to you and try to set the record straight. That's all we're told to come here for. And as long as you were honest and kept with it, they kind of said, we're going to get a lawyer to come. And a lawyer has nothing to do with anything. Have you sign an affidavit, set the record straight, and keep you as Jane Doe, just to kind of clear out, just clear the truth. Henderson says, right. We just want to know that Jay-Z he was there, but he had nothing to do with your sexual assault. Butler says, and that's all. Like, we're not asking you to say nothing bad happened to you. We're not here to say that you're, just that. And Henderson says, yeah, and we're not dismissing the fact that something happened to you. That has nothing to do with, but we just, the next page here. But we just want to clarify that Jay-Z did not have anything to do with it and that he didn't sexually assault you. Butler says, is that a fair assessment? Jane Doe says, yeah. This is 15 minutes into the conversation. And Butler says, okay, that's all. Henderson said, that's all we need. That's all we want. And that's all we want to do is just ask you about that. And if you're willing to sign an affidavit to the fact that Jay-Z has nothing to do with it. Butler says, and that's all it would say. It's not going to say anything else about anything else that happened to you that night. just that he was not a participant, then when they go forward, it's because they have a problem with other folks now, because they're trying to make up things against their client. So they're going to look to go after them, and they can leave your name out of it as a Jane Doe with cooperation, because then there's no reason to include you, because we do think you're kind of a victim. We think they kind of took advantage of you. And she says, but how does this help me? And Butler says, it keeps you anonymous. And to be honest, it sets the record straight. Like I said, I don't think it's necessarily fair that some of his kids think that they did something that they didn't do. And I'd say, obviously, he's very popular. A lot of people think that maybe he did something really horrible. And if he didn't, we want to straighten it out. Says, y'all, a nice afternoon. Have a nice afternoon, I'm assuming. So that's the end of the transcript that was filed today. That's the February 21st transcript of Jay-Z's investigators talking to the accuser.